In this video, we're going to look at pain from a couple of different angles, and it's important in the exploration of well-being to look at pain for a couple of different reasons. And we'll look at it through the paradigm of geometry. And if we look at this concept of kind of the undifferentiated chaos, the whole. So we've got a picture of the universe here. In geometry, this is symbolized by the circle. Now, when you compose a circle through geometry or a computer, what you do is you build a series of dots that added up become a circle, or you do a series of planes or lines, and when they get fine enough, the eye stops recognizing them as dots or lines and starts to connect the dots as one. And this is why in geometry, the sphere is the paradox. It's the epitome of the yin and the yang. Because on the one hand, to get a sphere, you have an infinite number of lines. That's a masculine expression of the sphere. And on the other hand, you have an infinite number of dots, again, particles, points, a masculine expression. But at the same time, you have the one. Now, in order to have consciousness, we have to have thought. There's no consciousness that is aware of consciousness that is not framed in thought. And there's no thought that is not framed in language. And what language does is it takes the one and it breaks it up into many, into compartments. And having broken the one into compartments, it then says, this one is A7, we'll call that word love. And this one is A8, we'll call that one hate. And then there's infinite gradients between any polarity. So once we break the whole into polarity, there are infinite gradients between the two extremes. So you can think of west and east, and you can say, well, it's 12,000 miles, and so in the middle we'd have 6,000 miles. But you can divide 6,000 miles into 3,000 miles. You can divide 3,000 miles into 1.5 thousand miles, and you can actually do this infinitely, and that's where you get your grayscale. There's always something worse. There's always something better, because these extreme polarities are ideas at best. And we see the circular nature, we see the paradoxical nature of reality when you get into a plane and you fly west, and you just keep flying straight west. And you get further west, but eventually you go all the way around the planet, and you find yourself arriving east of where you took off. In other words, there's an intimate relationship with extremes. If you try to be kind and just keep following this path of extreme kindness, you end up being cruel. When you set off to be completely selfless, you end up being very selfish in a healthy way, because it's enjoyable to live in a world being of service, being of value, where everyone around you is abundant and happy in a sustainable ecology. You may set out to be the most selfless person that's ever been, but the extreme of selflessness to be so effective, because it's not really selfless to be mediocre. I mean, if you're going to be of service and help the planet and help the ecology, you might as well know what you're doing. Now, if you're really, really competent at understanding other people, at healing trauma, at building relationships, at navigating difficult conversations, at planting trees, if you're really, really good at these things, and if you're good at making a lot of money and investing them in these ways, if you're just amazing because you want to be selfless, well, you can't be selfless if you don't know how to drive a car, don't have a dollar, have zero respect because you don't know what you're doing in any particular area. It's kind of hard to be selfless. Because, you may try, but if you try and give someone a ride and you drive their car into a tree, it's not very selfless, is it? It's pretty selfish because you didn't bother to get good at what you're doing. And so if you really want to be selfless, you've got to be highly competent, highly effective at helping and serving all these people. It just so happens that the most enjoyable world that an individual can live in is one in which they are in a state of flow that is highly competent and highly effective. And in that state of competency and effectiveness, help people more efficiently. It's fun to be competent. It's miserable to be impotent. It's fun to be in flow. It's miserable to be in constant self-absorption. In other words, there's not that much difference between being in a completely selfless and completely selfish reality. The problem is the mediocrity in between. Sitting around getting fat, watching porn and docudramas is not selfless or selfish. It's mediocre. And so you have this kind of muddle, warm spot kind of ambiguity in the middle. But extreme selfishness and extreme selflessness are identical. They're just pursued. You're heading out west and ending up east, or you're heading out east and ending up west, because they connect. But in order to understand something, you've got to make these distinctions: selfishness, selflessness, east, west, well-being and pain, mediocrity and competency. And yet they have a lot in common. So it's a somewhat synthetic, an arbitrary creation. Because to be conscious, one needs thought. In order for thought, one needs language. And perhaps more accurately, to be conscious of being conscious, one needs thought, which means one needs language, which means one has to take the one and break it up into all these bits. When you break the one planet into billions of inches, you get lots of little bits. When you're aware, zooming in on lots of little bits, you've got a fair amount of consciousness. So you've got consciousness through distinction. And words are what break things up. If we call this a hand, there's not a lot of awareness. If we call this a thumb, there's more awareness because we've cut the whole into pieces. A thumb, the thumbnail, the forefinger nail, bending, a joint, skin, bone. The more words we inject into this interconnected ecology, this one, the more conscious we become of the object, of the hand. And so we cannot truly understand white without black. We cannot understand well-being or a life worth living without understanding pain and a miserable and mediocre life. And so, to start off with, we take the one and we divide it into two. And then we create polarity. So we have pain and we have well-being. Now, the more nuanced, the more words basically that we use to cut these up. Mental pain, emotional pain. So now we've got 3 lines of pain. Physical pain, financial pain. We can keep cutting the polarity into subcategories. As we do so, we become more conscious. We also become more effective. We see what happens in aid, for example, when Western countries give aid. They think of it in, let's give some money to, Africa. It's a continent, but let's give some money over here, and we get it into the country. But then often the people who need the least end up embezzling and corrupting and taking the most, and very little actually gets to the people who need. So it's not actually a country that needs money. There's always corrupt billionaires in any country that the last thing they need is money. And there's always incredibly poor people who often don't have a tablet or a computer to fill out the form to apply for the bureaucracy of disbursement, who actually really need the money. They're just too sick to get out of bed and go get it. And so if we could make a distinction between individuals and get the people who need the most money, the kind of money they need at the time they need it most, the point where, before they're dead. If you catch a terminal disease because you don't have any vitamin D, for example, and then you get money after you're terminally ill to prolong the illness, it's not as effective as getting that money a few months earlier before you contracted the terminal illness and, because you were missing $2 of vitamins, and then $10,000 is used to prolong your drawn-out and excruciating death. So, these distinctions are incredibly important, and they are the domain of human consciousness because they don't actually exist otherwise. So in order to understand well-being and a life worth living, we've got to understand pain. So let's look at pain here. So what is pain? And how are we going to get all these little dots off? Well, in order for there to be pain, there has to be something within everything that we want, that we desire. And there also has to be separation from our identity. An identity is a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that is exclusionary by nature, meaning whatever it is that you use to define your sense of identity, is distinct from 99.9% of all that is, of all that was, and all that will be. You, let's look at the physical body, are not even a billionth of the universe. You're not even a billionth of the universe, and you're even less when you consider time, because much of the universe is happening in the future, and much of it is happening in the past, and you're happening in a very tiny little part of that past and future. So you're very tiny, and you're here. You're identifying with a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. That pattern is here. Now, what you desire in the midst of all that is over here. Now, there's a gap, meaning if there's no gap, then you don't really desire it, because desire exists in the tension between wanting something that isn't here yet. You don't desire to have eaten what you just ate. But if you're hungry, you may desire what you're about to eat. If somebody just paid you $100 million, you don't desire that particular $100 million, because desire is defined by wanting something that you don't have. Now, the difference between medicine and toxin is dosage. Take alkaline and acid. Is your body too alkaline? Which one is right? Is acid good or is alkaline good? Well, I'm a gardener, and you learn that the pH in the soil has a certain range in which if you get the pH in that range, the soil will compost and release nutrients to the plants that most plants can only absorb and extract nutrients out of the soil in a very small window between 2 acid and 2 alkaline. You could think of it in temperature, like we're extracting life out of a temperature continuum. And we as human beings can probably do pretty well to 40 below zero if we've got good coats and stuff like that. And maybe 130 degrees, 140 degrees, Fahrenheit, 40 degrees below zero, 140 degrees if we've got some air conditioning and lots of water. We can extract life out of that temperature. But put a human being in a 12,000 degree ecology, and they burn up. Put a human being in 12,000 degrees below zero, and they can't move. They can't even open their mouth without instantly, freezing, icicles within the mouth. And so it's these continuums. We see, you could say that life would be boring without anything to desire, that boredom is having everything you want already without having to do anything. It's boring. You've got it all. It's all known. And you don't have to walk, get out of bed. It's just there. So it's not very stimulating. It's certainly not much of a challenge. But a little bit out ahead, you've got desire. And I desire this. And you could say that my desire makes life less boring. My desire fueled into motivated growth and skill building makes my life quite interesting. But as the object one desires gets further and further and further and further away, the desire becomes pain, becomes dissociation. The distance between what one longs for and what one experiences is bigger and bigger. And so one could say that having no distance between what one desires and what one experiences is boredom. Having a little bit of distance between what one has and what one desires is desire. Having a little bit more distance is aching motivation, cutting edge, really working at it. And then beyond there comes helplessness, becomes pain, becomes frustration, becomes a sense of loss, a sense of despair. And all that we're looking at is the distance, the proximity between where one is, what one's identity is, and what one desires. And so you give someone a little bit of belladonna and it may keep them alive. You give them a little bit more and it'll kill them. A little bit of morphine may numb the pain. A little bit more morphine may lead to an overdose. And so we're back into this paradoxical relationship where we're taking the one, the feminine expression of all that is, and we're cutting it in half. And you could call that the wound, because in the fall from the garden of good and evil, the fall from the garden is defined by the polarity of the knowledge. What is the knowledge? It's the language. It's the thought. Because before you have good and evil, you have all that is, without words, without knowledge. And then you take the one and you cut it in half. Now, this is the wound. You take your body and cut it in half, and there's pain there. There's a rupturing of wholeness. And so you have a descent into suffering because the one is no longer whole. When the marriage as one ruptures, and now you have two completely different individuals that start to dissociate, the child experiences the rupture, the gap, where the one family becomes two. And it's, how do I reform the one? So you have the descent, the knowledge of good and evil, the sense of polarity as the one becomes two through polarity, through language. So separation from and longing for is pain. Separation from, longing for. As that gap gets bigger and bigger, the pain gets bigger and bigger. And there's a couple of different things that can manage that pain. one can long for something more attainable, or at least focus on something more attainable, because it's really about where one puts one's attention. So if rather than longing desperately to be retired at age 20 with large debts, etc., and wanting to be retired and wealthy, etc., if instead the next goal is to get better at doing one's job tomorrow, well, that's something you can do. If you're longing to be retired and wealthy, and the scale gets too big, it's then unclear how to bridge the gap. If you turn a meter into millimeters and do 3 millimeters and 3 millimeters and 3 millimeters and 3 millimeters, well, in a very short amount of time, you have traversed the meter. And so what comes out of this awareness, this peace, is that a deep understanding of pain, of suffering, of misery, of mediocrity, of the opposite of a 10x life, etc., is necessary to anchor. It's the antithesis of what is known. So in a certain sense, it defines it. Just as a 10x life, a beautiful life, a meaningful life, defines through antithesis what is not a meaningful life. They're both important to study. Now, the other reason that pain is so important is that a very large portion of the brain is organized. So about 4/5 of the average brain is organized in its programming to prioritize awareness of pain and response to it. Now, where we see this is, here you are, and you're in a lovely little river. Wonderful meadows all along here, nice mountains up here. Here you are in your river. And everything's fine, but you see a little wriggling shape in the corner of your eye, and you're instantly petrified because your brain has a deep biological memory to recognize, one, that a wriggling shape could be a water snake, and two, that a water snake could end your life. And so it's just as sunny out there. It's a nice sun. It's just as sunny. All the tens of thousands of flowers in the vista are just as beautiful. The water feels wonderful. Everything except this one wriggling shape is as it should be. But 2/3 of your brain immediately goes into full-scale alert, prioritizing the negative, prioritizing probable or potential pain. Now, this is a mixed bag, because the fact that 2/3 of your brain is doing all of this stuff is effective at making sure you look, see the snake, get out of the way before it bites you, and live to tell the tale. That's survival. It's counterproductive because 99% of reality is wonderful, beautiful in that scenario. But 2/3 of your attention is on the one thing, just a foot long, out of hundreds and hundreds of square meters of perfect and beautiful things. Just this tiny little, less than 1% dominates your awareness until you answer the question, will this kill me? Can I stay alive and go back and enjoy the landscape? Now, if you know your snakes and you realize this is a harmless one and you can overcome the biological instinct, then you can smile and say, oh, it's a garter snake getting a drink of water. If you know your snakes and you realize this is a deadly water moccasin, I got to get out of here, you can quickly take action and live to tell the tale. And if you know the threat, if you can define the threat, then you can calm down after you've mitigated it. If the threat is undefined, you have to remain anxious in your fear centers of the brain because there is a threat that is unknown. And so your brain is going to, bombard you with fear, which is a miserable experience, until you figure out what's going on. And that's a motivator. You're going to figure out what's going on after, being bombarded by fear enough. And so you have pros and cons with everything. So you have a more anxious life, but you're alive. And, there's the issue. Now, if we look at this, basic 4/5 of the brain that's prioritized to fear, pain, and pain avoidance, you can realize that you've got high leverage to reducing pain. In other words, if you're intelligent and you understand that every insult that someone gives to you is going to register 5 times louder than every compliment because of the way your brain is wired, then you'll understand that reducing insults is a more effective use of your time than adding praise, because you'd have to find 5 more things to be praised about to have the same impact as one insult. And even then, some people have it more highly leveraged toward the negative if there's undiagnosed, unsorted out trauma. And so you have 2 piles over here. Good and bad. Bad in this case refers to pain. Now, if every brick you remove from this pile reduces your pain per unit by 500%, and every brick you add to the good pile adds 20% to your well-being because of the way the brain is wired, then you can see that if it takes the same amount of energy to take one of these bricks off of the pile as it does to put one of these bricks on the pile, but this removal of pain is leveraged 500% by the amygdala, etc., in the brain, then you want to remove pain as an intelligent investor in well-being. You want to remove pain until such point as you can't remove any more pain. If there's something irritating you, get rid of it, sort it out, clear it out, get it done, get it talked about, get it off the plate. Because the exact same thing that's going on in the beautiful day wading in the river with the little wriggling shape, which you may glance and it's just a tree, a little root, that's washing down the stream. And so it's no big deal. Well, then you can go back to the water. Well, the same thing is going on at dinner. One person out of 5 says one thing out of 5, and suddenly 80% of your consciousness is defending against that pain. They think I'm worthless. They're making jokes at my expense. They don't respect me. These bubbling up things are getting high leverage because of the way your brain is wired. Now, if you can make a request, I'd like to make a request at this table that that kind of comment not be directed at me or other people. Could we have some agreement about that, or is that something we need to talk about? That's a request. Well, that request, if everyone says, sure, I didn't understand, sorry, and you move on. Now, 80% of your brain is now free to enjoy the good pile. Now, on the alternative side, you'd have to place 5 bricks on the good pile. 5 people would all have to say one nice thing about you to get the same amount of raw impact in your brain as this one negative thing. And so if you can avoid, clear up, reduce the probability of, etc., one negative thing, you have a 500% leverage because the way your brain is built. That's very important to understand. You get more mileage reducing pain than adding pleasure. And you can see this on any metric you look at. Listening to your favorite song on a beautiful speaker, but one hissing noise is going on in one of the speakers is blown out, and it just drives you nuts. Now, 90% of the song is fine. 9 out of 10 of the speakers are fine, but your mind goes to the dissonance to sort it out. So that's a really important thing to understand about your brain. And there's this comment that, when I was a kid, they would, the kids would chant back and forth, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me." Well, that's a lie. We all know it's a lie, but it's meant to put on a bold face and not reveal helplessness and rage to someone who's obviously trying to elicit helplessness and rage. And in so doing, the goal is to transfer the helplessness and rage to the bully, to the abuser. So the bully is trying to figure out what's the most hurtful thing to say, with the goal of transferring their helplessness and their rage to you so that you'll fall apart because they said that most hurtful of things. And what this little chant is meant to do is to tell the bully, aren't you dumb for wasting your time? Because you can't affect me no matter what you say. And then that's going to enrage the bully and make the bully feel helpless. And then usually what happens if there's really a differential of power is then the bully gets tired of taunting you and goes and punches you because they want to make absolutely sure that the message gets across that, they're big and powerful and you're not. And the law of mass, which dictates that the larger energy always dominates the smaller energy when they meet in a head-on collision. A bowling ball will always send a pinball flying. The law of mass says that that's going to work. And so, but we all know, of course, that words can hurt us. But what are they hurting? They're hurting the identity. An identity is a circle. It's a somewhat arbitrary circle because we are all innately connected to our ecology. You cannot scientifically create a clear line between the individual and the parents that gave birth to them. It's kind of a difficult line to draw, isn't it? This is a distinct individual that has nothing to do with the people with whom they were originated. I mean, if you don't exist without these two people, it's a little bit shaky to come up with an argument that says, I'm completely separate from the people without whom I don't even exist. So that's a pretty shaky argument. But then you take people and you say these are a distinct group of people. They have nothing to do with these other groups of people. Well, that's a pretty shaky argument as well, because, hang on a minute. That's a pretty shaky thing as well, because if we look at the genetics of any group of people, I believe they all trace back to Africa. So if you cut out, like if you're in an equation, you say 2 minus 7 plus 4 multiplied by 8, da, da, da. If you delete any of the numbers that lead to the ultimate equation, the present moment is the ultimate equation. It's the ultimate answer to the mathematical equation of the past, of everything in momentum. If you delete the 7, you don't get the same answer. So it's not so clear that one group of people is actually innate. And if you go back 1,000 years and you kill off the ancestors then, and then your ancestors never happened, and neither did the ancestors of your diverse enemy, well, it's a little bit pointless to argue that that's really so separate. Now, then you have the phenomena of ecology. Now, we can say that, the human being is a distinct individual. People are distinct from their ecology. I'm not a table. I'm not the ground. I'm not this. But every few seconds I take a breath. And that breath is the shit of trees. If you think of all life forms as being something that absorbs energy in one form and releases energy in another form. We absorb fruit from a mango tree. Well, that's the waste that's the droppings of the mango tree. We're absorbing the shit of trees with each breath and with each bite. And the trees are absorbing the shit of humans. The feces and urine produced by the human species is fertilizer and food for trees. And the carbon dioxide of human lungs are food for the leaves of trees. So it's a reciprocal relationship. Now, if all of the trees vanish in a minute, and 4 minutes later I die of asphyxiation, can we really say that I am a distinct system that has nothing to do with the trees? It's not very scientific. If I die as soon as the relationship with trees is interrupted, then how exactly am I distinct if I can't exist without? I'm in a codependent relationship. Admittedly, I may be a little bit more reliant on trees than trees are on me in particular. but it's a co-dependent ecological relationship that is perceived as an artificially distinct one through language. How does it happen? We call that a tree. We call this me. So who's me? I'm a pattern. I'm a pattern of thinking. I'm a pattern of feeling. I'm a pattern of doing. I'm a pattern of being. I'm a pattern of speaking. So thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. I'm a pattern. And I create an arbitrary line that says, this is me. These are my thoughts. How do I know they're mine? I repeat them. And I call them me. I identify with them. How do I know these feelings are mine? I felt the same way yesterday and the day before that. They're a pattern. That's what a pattern is. It's a repeat loop. I identify with this shape. Now, if I identify with being loved by all, and two or three people make snide remarks about me at the dinner table, and other people chuckle, then what I have chosen to identify with, my pattern of thinking and feeling, is shattered. Because what I'm holding in here is not fitting what's going on out there. So what the dinner table just did was they drew a line and broke my identity. It's, particularly if it's fragile. Everyone has to like me or I'm done for. Well, I'm done for now because that doesn't sound like the thing that someone who likes me would say. So my identity has shattered. My pattern of thinking and feeling is now gone. And whatever we identify is a trauma to have broken. Now, I'm referring, when I say thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. The doing is the actions we do with the body, but the being is our presence and the body itself. We need to have a body in order to take action. Well, if I'm standing there and someone shoves my body and I go flying, I have an identity crisis. Because how can I hold the pattern? If I am this, and now that's been violated in some way, now that's not me anymore. So what do I do then? Do I adopt the identity of a victim? Do I adopt, what do I make of that? Am I a coward? Am I gracious? Am I spiritual? What do I do when I move away from the bully? When I grasp that I'm not in control? My identity of being in control is shattered. It's broken, and it's replaced by the outer ecology's identity for me. It says, no, you're not in control. The reality is in control. And so you think you're in control. You think you're in control, but you're not. And so it's difficult to have this dynamic going on where we're defining ourselves in one way, but who we define ourselves to be may or may not be allowed in the ecology of which we are a part of our identity. And when our identity is violated, out of our control, and we don't know who we are, we lose the pattern That's called trauma. It's called flatlining. In physical sense, your heartbeat is there. Pam, you're hit by a force bigger than you. And now your body flatlines. Your mind flatlines. You no longer know who you are because you were the pattern, like this and like this. You were that pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. But now, in a single day, in a single event, you've flatlined. And now you're defined by the event, by the trauma, by the reality. And the ego is the one that identifies, that seeks an I. And it's a very, very fragile part. And so because it's so small, this is kind of, one of the other things that goes on. Here we have our ecology, and here we have our identity. And the law of mass dictates that whenever a bowling ball and a pinball collide, the pinball goes flying. The bowling ball continues on its original trajectory. The ecology, the cultural ecology, the natural ecology, the universe ecology, the ecology is so many times bigger than we are. The scale, we're talking hundreds of times bigger. And what that means is that when we collide, when an infant collides with their parents, it is a trauma. Because the infant's pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being is shattered by the giant that is the parent. When a small sibling is pummeled and bullied by an older sibling, maybe only a third in different side, but the degree of trauma is defined by the differential of scale. And one of the things that is not clearly understood is that trauma is a phenomena of scale. Now, when you are regressed to age 3, regression occurs when you didn't deal with the original trauma because you lacked adequate resources and support at the time. So at age 3, you dissociated, left your body. The trauma stays in that state of smallness. It doesn't develop. That part of the self and psyche stays feeling 3 years old. Now, what happens is similar traumas can then regress you, meaning can capture your attention to where you feel like you're 3 years old. Well, as soon as you feel 3 years old, if you're in an environment in a conflict with 5 or 6 grown-ups that are all this size, you feel completely overwhelmed, terrified, and unable to hold your identity as a 3-year-old internally. And so you may go into fight, flight, freeze, if neither of those options are available, or fawn, or please. How can I please these giants around me? Now, as soon as I abandon my identity, this was my pattern of thinking and my pattern of feeling, but because I'm surrounded, because I'm outnumbered, I'm asking, what do I have to think and feel and say and do so that you'll like me, so that you won't kill me? And they say, well, we want something like this. And you say, well, yeah, but my identity is this. And they're like, yeah, but we don't really care about your identity. We want something like this. And so you abandon, you let go, relinquish this pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. and you adopt this pattern. Why? Because it reduces the trauma in relationship to larger forces. And this is just incredibly important to understand as part of the landscape of pain. Pain is separation from. In this sense, our identity is our sense of self that we freely chose, that we're familiar with. The more frightened we are of the unknown, the more important it is to stay in familiar terrain. But when we're traumatized, when something much bigger than us knocks into us and changes the shape, we're taken violently, abruptly into the unknown. We lose cohesion, coherence with our identity. And this little fragile thing called the self that is holding the illusion that it is separate. And it is an illusion, because if you take away the language and just look at the science, there is no person without parents. There is no parents without family, without grandparents. There's no grandparents without species. There's no species without other species. There's no species of any kind without planet. There's no planet without solar system. The sun disappears and all life as we know it on Earth ends in a matter of days. The sun changes its mind, changes its identity, its pattern of moving around at this temperature in this way. The laws of physics, laws, habits, identities, patterns of relationship shift. Sun wakes up one day and says, I've had enough. Let's change my molecular structure. Well, there is no species without a solar system. There's no solar system without a galaxy. There's no galaxy without a universe. There's no universe without a multiverse. There's no multiverse without creation. There's no creation without destruction. Physicists tell us that nothing is created or destroyed. Energy in formation takes different shapes. And this atom becomes this new thing. It doesn't just disappear into a void in a magic trick. It becomes something else. A body dies and blossoms in a rose that absorbs the nitrogen from the blood in the body. If the body is buried and a rose is planted over the body. So the body migrates into being something else, another form. But if I'm identifying with this form and I'm getting further and further away from that which I identify with and that which my identity longs for, I'm going deeper and deeper into pain. And at the point where that message, because if we look at pain as a useful, if we look at it as a useful bit of feedback. So here's our body as a metaphor, and our body is cut in half. Well, instantly there's a lot of pain. The pain, the intensity of the pain communicates the priority. And admittedly, if a chainsaw saws the body in half, it's probably done for in today's state. But let's just say we saw an arm off. So an arm is off, massive amounts of pain, because we long for wholeness. We long for control of our arm. But when our arm is severed, our identity is shattered. We don't have control of the severed portion of the arm, and we may not have control of our body if we don't get to an operating room and cauterize the wound and properly amputate and anesthetize and all that. So pain is useful as a signal that we need to take action to restore, to heal the wound. Our mental body is the mental identity. Our emotional body is the emotional identity. The physical body is the physical identity. The financial body is the bank account, the investments, the portfolios. When that is shattered and we strongly identify with it, that's me, then me is shattered. And we want to put it back together again. So pain is the first thing. Put it back together, quick. This is important. So at that level, pain is a useful stimulus for action. Now, if we can't put it back together, the pain gets louder as the separation grows. If you stitch a finger back on pretty rapidly, then it'll still live. But a week later, a moldy finger or something, you cannot reattach it to the hand. So if you can reassemble a useful identity, because here's another thing. An identity is a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. But it's not a very intelligent pattern in many cases. If we look at what most people think, what they feel, what they do, what they say, and how they are in a 24-hour period, many of us consume lots of energy, repeat thoughts, feelings, and things furiously. We have a solid identity, that's me, but it's not a very enjoyable, constructive, innovative, creative identity. It's just what we call me. And so, if there is a rupture in the identity, a trauma, first thing, it's worth looking at, is this worth defending? Meaning, maybe it's a good thing that this pattern is knocked off, and what would you put in its place? Because we need an I. We need an identity. We need a pattern that we say that's us, as opposed to what we pretend is not us. But how do we, what is it? And how do we repair it? So pain is useful if we can make repairs. If we can't make repairs, we may need to shift the identity to a new identity. For example, once your arm has been amputated, having an identity of two hands and trying to drive a bicycle with two hands and falling over every single day is not a constructive use of that pain. So the pain may shift to grieving, to letting go of an old identity, getting a prosthetic or learning one-handed bicycling or designing the steering wheel so that you can now have a new identity, a new pattern that works with reality as it is. So pain becomes destructive if you hang on to an identity that you can't grasp, that you can't reclaim, and it just drifts further and further away from you. You're moving towards impotence and despair and denial. And it's a tricky thing because, miracles are simply events that happen better than the people involved could reasonably expect. Something happens much better and it wasn't at all expected, and they came out with some new drug or something and what was going to be terminal cleared up. That's a miracle. But if it looks like you're going to be dying in 3 months, and just because you don't want to, you ignore and block out all the symptoms that you're dying and dying and dying, then it's not it's not as useful. And so that's important to understand. When pain becomes so overwhelming it stops action, then it becomes counterproductive. I don't want to do anything. I don't want to get out of bed because I'm in so much pain. And I don't know how to stop the pain. Now we're in a pretty dangerous place. And so it's very useful to know what it is that we long for and that's further and further away, what it is that we long for that we cannot create, and how to either create it or let go of that and create something instead that is doable. And so here are a couple of different ways to work with pain, to understand pain within the frameworks of human consciousness, within the polarity of pain and ecstatic well-being.